before you is a cannon crew of members of Ebenezer Stevens' Independent Battalion of Artillery under the command of Captain Buckland. Now, these men were present at Fort Ticonderoga from the spring of 1777 until the evacuation in July of that year. Now, the men of the Independent Battalion of Artillery under Ebenezer Stevens, some of these men were hardened veterans. Those who had already served at Ticonderoga in the years prior. Some of these artillerymen had even been up to outside the gates of Quebec City in the winter of 1775. They also drew in drafts, these men coming from New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Connecticut to fill out the ranks of the men on the guns. They would also be drafting men coming as far south from Boston. Ebenezer Stevens sending out his captains to draft men from Boston, approaching here to Ticonderoga in February of 1777. He would draw in 150 drafts from militia from New York, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. Now, the men of Ebenezer Stevens' Independent Battalion of Artillery would be clothed in these very smart black coats with red facings. They would finish off their very professional military appearance with white small clothes that were captured British clothing, fine cocked hats, as well as spatterdashers above their shoes. The drafts being drawn from all the different northern colonies of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Connecticut would come in a smattering of regimental coats as well as civilian clothing. Now, the equipment of Ebenezer Stevens' men would, of course, be their cartouche boxes, their ammo pouches, their bayonet slings with their bayonets, and their muskets being slung across their backs so that they could defend the peace if necessary. And each one of these men actually carried equipment that allowed them to fire off this gun. Now, the man to the right front of the piece, he carries the sponge staff. Now, the sponge rammer is a long wooden pole with two turned ends on either end, one of which has sheep's fleece drawn over that. That is a sponge that allows you to cool off the gun and smother any embers left inside of it after a previous shot. At the other end of it is your rammer head, which allows you to, with the weight of that rammer, seat the shot in the wad against the breech of the barrel. Now, the man to the left front of the piece, he has another hardwood shaft. This time it is called the lantern or the wad hook. Now, at one end you have a spoon of copper where you would put loose powder or cartridges of powder and place it into the barrel, turning it around to deposit that load. Now, at the other end of it, you have what looks like an iron pig's tail or a corkscrew. That is your wad hook. That is put down the barrel after a shot and turned around to remove any fouling left inside the gun from a previous shot. Now, the man to the right rear of the piece, he is the man who primes, the bombardier. He has two tools, one of which is a powder horn. That powder horn has 2 pounds of finely ground powder inside it that he's going to use to prime the piece. Now, to make a connection between the priming charge and the cartridge in the barrel, he uses a brass pick, poking a hole down into the touch hole, piercing the cartridge so he can put a quill into that cartridge. Now, the man to the left rear of the gun, he's the one who actually sets this piece off. He has the lin stick as well as the port fire. Now, the lin stick is a small pole with 2 iron jaws on either end that holds slow match, which is slow burning hemp rope treated with wine spirits and sulfur, and it'll burn slow enough yet hot enough to start what is called the port fire in his left hand. The port fire is essentially an 18th century road flare. It is tightly woven paper with ingredients inside it that will allow it to burn even in the most harshest of conditions, even burning underwater. Now, the man to the rear of the gun, he carries a haversack. Inside that haversack, he has the ammunition as well as wadding. And all the other men that are not directly on positions on the gun, they being matrosses, those who may have drag ropes, they can help move this gun and position it. Now the guns at Ticonderoga, by the time of the siege, numbered 104. These guns being almost entirely iron guns. They would be French guns and English guns. Now the way in which you measure a gun is by the size of the shot that it fires. Now our gun here is a French 4-pound gun, sitting on a traveling carriage. The guns here were to be put upon carriages that were not too bulky, but not too rickety, so that they could be able to move these guns around easily. Now the guns themselves, all being mostly iron, iron is a choice material to make cannons out of. Now iron is abundant in the earth, it's relatively easy to work with, and it's relatively inexpensive. But to make these guns strong enough, they need to be cast very, very thick to prevent from bursting. As I mentioned before, this gun is a French 4-pound gun. And whether it be a 4-pounder or say a 12-pounder, they all have the same parts. But these guns came in a variety of sizes. They had 3-pounders, 4, 6, 8, 12, 18, 24, and even a large 32-pound cannon. But as I mentioned, regardless of the size, they all have the same parts. Now when I talk about the gun, I mean the barrel, that big long metal tube. It stretches all the way from the front at the muzzle, all the way to the rear of the gun at the breech. And all the way through it, drilled out of a solid piece of iron, is the bore. Now at the rear of the gun, you may see a doorknob-shaped object. That is the cascabel. That can have ropes lashed to it to move it, or move it up and down on a cannon engine. It also allows for the aiming of it with crows or hand spikes. Now on the top of the breech, there is a small hole, known as the touch hole or the vent hole, which allows a connecting point between your priming charge and the charge in the barrel that sends your projectile down range. Now towards the front of the gun, or rather the center of it, at its center of gravity, is going to be 2 trunnions, 2 turned iron cylinders. It allows for this gun to sit on its carriage. Now by connecting this gun to the carriage, it has what are called cap squares. Cap squares are iron bands that go over those trunnions and prevent the gun from flying off its carriage after being fired. Now the carriage you see here is known as a traveling carriage. It has 2 large wheels connected by an axle, much different from naval or garrison carriages, which have much smaller wheels that don't have to move very far on the walls of a fortification or on the deck of a vessel. But this carriage with its large wheels can easily be moved over rough terrain. Now, those 2 wheels are connected by an axle, and on that axle are 2 long cheeks that extend all the way to the rear of the gun, and is connected by the transoms and transom bolts. Now underneath the rear of the gun at the breech is going to be your stool bed, and there is a screw, an elevation screw that allows you to change the elevation of this gun to aim it. Some of these carriages even had what was called a tiller, a curved piece of wood at the rear of the gun that also helped in aiding moving this piece. Now, as I mentioned before, this type of gun is a French iron 4-pound gun. So if this is a 4-pound gun, and we measure a gun by the weight of shot that it fires, how heavy is this ball that my comrades are passing out to you? 4 pounds, yeah, absolutely right. It's not a trick question. Now at this time, it calls for 1/3 the weight of your shot in powder to fire this gun. So if we have a 4-pound ball and we need 1/3 the weight of the shot in powder, how much powder is contained inside these paper cartridges? 1 1/3, absolutely. So inside that paper cartridge is 1 1/3 pounds of gunpowder. These cartridges, as well as all of the ammunition, would be prepared by the men of Stevens in artillery over in the laboratory on Mount Independence. And these men would be issued special trousers to wear to work on all of this powder while they're in the laboratory, as to not soil their uniforms. Now, another ingredient to fire this gun is also what is called wadding, or rather in this case, junk. And it is literally that. It is junk rigging, meaning it's old hemp rope, no longer fit to bear any weight. It is shredded and turned and tied up into these little donut-shaped objects, and one of which will sit on top of the powder. Next will go in the ball, and again another wad will go on top of the ball. Now, our gun here is capable of firing at its max elevation, 45 degrees, or what is known as random shot, 1.7 miles. Just to give you a sense of scale, if you turn behind you and look to the top of Mount Defiance, from here, that is 0.7 miles away. Yet, your enemy is not always going to be that far away. And if your enemy gets closer, let's say the point-blank range for this gun, which is about 800 yards, we could switch to a different type of shot, known as grape shot. Still weighing 4 pounds, this type of shot consists of 9 1¼ inch iron balls tied up in a hemp bag with linen rope around a central post and a platform. And when fired out of the gun, it breaks apart, sending all of those pieces downrange. Now, if we have to fire this gun in an expedited rate, we can switch to something called fixed shot. Now, what fixed shot is again, your 4-pound cannonball, but it is now strapped to a wooden wad, and on the bottom of it is a linen bag full of all the powder you need. So you don't have to load these ingredients separately. You simply place that entire fixed shot into the barrel. Now, the men of Ebenezer Stevens' Independent Battalion of Artillery, they needed to fire these guns in a safe manner. Say, for instance, if Captain Buckland rides up to the Sandy Redoubt after the alarm gun sounds saying, "Okay, men, man out the piece and fire whenever you want." Things could get quite dangerous. So these men need to follow a step-by-step procedure on how to fire these guns safely. Now, the officers of Ebenezer Stevens Battalion, who had previously served in the Royal Artillery in the previous war, they taught new officers and new recruits how to fire these guns. Not having written this exercise down, it was taught by word of mouth. Yet, after the American Revolution, a man named William Stevens, no relation to Ebenezer Stevens, writes down the way in which these guns were fired that he used as an artillerist during the American Revolution. And during this process, there is a series of commands to go about firing this piece. To begin, the men would first hear the command, "Men out the piece!" They would all take their positions on the gun, grabbing their implements and getting ready. "Advance! Sponge!" Now the man to the right front, he brings the sponge staff from his left side up and over to the right side. "Tend the bed!" The man to the rear of the piece, he puts his thumb over that touch hole. And the next step is to advance cartridge. Now a cartridge is brought up, but first the man to the right front needs to sponge the gun. He plunges that sponge down into the barrel, wringing it out first, extinguishing any embers that may be left inside it. Once he extracts that sponge, he flips it around and places the rammer head on the end of the barrel, ready to ram down that cartridge after the command of the man to the left front, which he receives. He charges the piece. With that long ladle, he puts that cartridge in there, slides it all the way down the barrel, rotates it 90 degrees, depositing that cartridge in the barrel, withdrawing it, and placing the shot and the wad on top of it. Grab that cartridge. Now the man to the right front uses the other end of that staff, using the weight of it to ram down properly the cartridge, the wads, and the shots. Hey! Now the man to the right rear, our bombardier, he takes out his priming wire, that brass pick, and he pokes down into that cartridge, piercing it open so that he may stick a quill. down into that cartridge. And peace! Now the bombardier gets behind the gun, and you all can do it too. You can aim the piece. Take your thumbs and look through it, and now you have created a sight. This is what the gunners would do to maintain an accurate fire. Once ready and satisfied with his shot, they would hear the command to fire! Now these men going through these steps would instill a sense of discipline and a continuous fire that they knew how to do when ready. When it came time to actually defend Ticonderoga from the various redoubts, they would hear from their commanders only one order, and that would be load! Now they're going to go through the steps much faster than they did before, utilizing that fixed shot that we talked about before, simply putting that inside the barrel instead of all those loose parts. But now, before the man to the right front sponged the piece, the man to the left front, he spun that ladle around and he put that wad hook down there to remove any of the fouling that was left inside the barrel after that previous shot. Now the men of Ebenezer Stevens' Independent Battalion of Artillery, they would be manning the different redoubts across Ticonderoga, from the Great Redoubt down to the Sandy Redoubt. And when came time, they would simply fire off shots with fire! Now a few months before July 1777, the men here in Ticonderoga had been preparing for the end of 1776 into 1777 for any attack that may come from the British. Earthen fortifications dotted the greater defenses of Ticonderoga from the southern end of Mount Independence here to the Ticonderoga Peninsula, with large redoubts like the Jersey Redoubt off to our northwest, all the way up to the heights of Carillon or Liberty Hill where the Great Redoubt was located. And these 3 miles of defenses were ready to fire off shots whenever the time came with the command to fire! Now in July, the men of Ebenezer Stevens' Independent Battalion of Artillery would man the line here at Ticonderoga in the final hours of the American-held Ticonderoga. They kept up the rate of fire. 250 men drawn from all the battalions of Ticonderoga to help fire these guns, to keep the British at bay, while the rest of their comrades evacuated out of the fort. And under the cover of darkness, the Americans made their way across the bridge into Mount Independence, and you could hear across the defenses of Ticonderoga the commands to fire! Even though documents like the Declaration of Independence and Thomas Paine's Common Sense made men free here in the colony, the real way in which these men became free was by the men of Ticonderoga holding the line of liberty here, maintaining these guns, firing them off, and defending this place as best they could in hopes that they could put into practice all the great words that were written in those liberating documents. Now with that being said, I want to thank you all tremendously for joining us for our cannon demonstration here on this Memorial Day. On this Memorial Day weekend, we remember those who made the ultimate sacrifice in defense of our country, whether it be in the 20th century or in the 18th century. Those men who fought and died here at Ticonderoga, putting into practice those ideals that were set out in historic documents.